With the end of the Civil War, America entered a new era. The country is entering an era of progress. A new generation of leaders will emerge. For the first time in the country's brief history, the man best suited to lead America is not a politician. He is a self-made man who, through sheer willpower, transformed a poor upbringing on the banks of New York Harbor into an empire. A man who will literally lay the foundation for the American economy as we know it today. This is the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt. The story of Cornelius Vanderbilt begins in 1810, when at age 16, he buys a small ferry boat with a $100 loan from his mother, which would be $2,500 today. After acquiring the boat, a flat-bottom sailing ship, he set about converting it into a freight and passenger ferry across New York Harbor. This line of work was far from easy, as the market for ferrymen was nearly saturated and thus very competitive. However, after just 6 months, Cornelius commanded his boat so skillfully that his own father could no longer get work hauling anything but his own produce across the bay. Here we see one of Cornelius's key traits, his willingness to compete and make the competition bleed, which, in those days, was rather literal. Another quality he has is the ability to be in the right place at the right time in order to take advantage of an opportunity that others fail to recognize. When conflict erupted between the United States and Britain, beginning off the War of 1812, the British blockaded the American East Coast and moved into New York Harbor, preventing unfriendly ships from entering and leaving the port. This posed a significant challenge for American merchants and traders, who were now forced to convey their goods via land rather than sailing them up and down the coast. But unlike many sailors who were reluctant to ally themselves with the British, Vanderbilt had no such reservations. Using his boat, he began transporting supplies for the British forces, but he also used his travels down the Hudson River to smuggle food back into the city. By collecting from both sides of the blockade, he was able to double his revenue, saving enough money not just to repay his mother, but also to buy 2 more boats. Shortly after the war's end, Vanderbilt's successes established him as a promising young captain, and he was hired to run a steam between New York and New Jersey, as well as his own ferries across New York Harbor. But, like his previous ventures throughout the war, Vanderbilt's new task was not entirely legal. At the time, interstate steamboat transport was monopolized, and Vanderbilt's employer, a businessman called Thomas Gibbons, was attempting to break it. But Gibbons knew he needed a tough manager to control things on the ground, and Vanderbilt fit the bill. During this time, he also served as a type of fixer for Gibbons, collaborating with Gibbons' attorney to present a successful case to the Supreme Court to abolish the interstate steamboat monopoly. When the steamboat monopoly was broken up, Vanderbilt and his steamship company were in a prime position to capitalize. He stayed with Gibbons for a little longer, but when the elder man died in 1826, he would only spend a few short years working for the man's son before venturing out on his own. He left the partnership with Gibbons in 1829 when he was 35 and began operating his own boat lines between New York and the rest of the region. He would also forge a covert agreement with another steamboat operator, Daniel Drew, with whom he could avoid rivalry on the lower Hudson River. Vanderbilt will become so synonymous with shipping that his nickname becomes the Commodore. Like every great entrepreneur, Vanderbilt saw an opportunity, transporting goods from one place to another. He had this vision, and he was going to execute that vision, turning it into reality. Then, at the peak of his power, just before the Civil War, he does the unthinkable. Construction of the first transcontinental railroad is currently underway, and the Commodore recognizes that its completion will revolutionize America, reducing cross-country travel time by months. Once again, Vanderbilt spots an opportunity that he can capitalize on. He starts selling his ships and investing the proceeds in railroads, not because he wants to, but has to. Railroads are a double-edged sword for his transport firm. On the one hand, they give enormous expansion opportunities, but on the other, they will cannibalize the market for transport ships. In business, you want to be in a growing market rather than a declining market. It's similar to what Jeff Bezos did in 1994 when he left his Wall Street job to start Amazon. He noticed that the internet was growing at 2,300% per year, and he wanted to be a part of it, and we all know how that ended. Whether it's 1861 or 1994, some traits are timeless, like the ability to identify growth possibilities. Nowadays, the blockchain industry is predicted to grow at a rate of 55 to 80% each year until 2030. So why not capitalize on it, like Vanderbilt did with railroads? You may accomplish just that with our partner Nexo. Unlike other exchanges, they offer real-time audits, ensuring unsurpassed security. If you join them through our link, you will receive $25 in free Bitcoin. So click the link in the description to get your free Bitcoin today. Now, let's return to the story of Vanderbilt. His investment in rail has paid off. By the end of the war, Vanderbilt is the wealthiest man in America, with a net worth of more than $68 million, which is comparable to $1.3 trillion today, a fortune unrivaled to this day. But even with all of his money, he cannot escape the carnage of the war. Vanderbilt had one son, George, who had the same physical strength and ability as him, but he died when he was still fairly young. Vanderbilt spent years on preparing George to take over the family business, not sharing his wisdom and his business insights with his other kids, and that turns out to be terrible for the family's fortune down the road. Now, the Commodore has to rely on his less accomplished son, William. Vanderbilt appoints his son William as the operations director of the Hudson Railroad and sends him to negotiate with a competitor, the New York Central Railroad. Vanderbilt would offer their passenger trains entry into Manhattan in return to handle their freight cargo for $200,000. But they will not even agree to $100,000, let alone $1. They believe that Vanderbilt's days are finished. When William returns from the meeting, the Commodore sees an opportunity to learn the competition that his days are far from over and teach William what it means to be a Vanderbilt. He owns the only rail bridge into New York City. It leads to the country's biggest port, which serves the whole continent. He knows this is the hammer he needs to beat his rivals down, so he tells William to close the Albany Bridge. By closing the bridge, millions of pounds of goods can't get to the rest of the country. This also leaves his competition with no way to make money, which slowly bleeds them dry. Yes, even at 72, the Commodore enjoys beating his opponents and watching them bleed. Before their stock becomes worthless, the rival railroad's presidents attempt to sell all of their shares, causing a sell-off on Wall Street. However, Vanderbilt was purchasing all of the stock that had suddenly flooded the market at rock-bottom prices. In a matter of days, Vanderbilt gains control of the competing railroad, creating the largest single-rail enterprise in America. The New York Central Railroad became the focal point of his empire, and it arrived as the unexpected result of a well-executed campaign to get revenge. Vanderbilt has established himself as the unquestioned king of railroads, and he now wants the world to know it. He sees a monument that will represent his great power. He directs the construction of a new station that will connect the three railroads, the Harlem, Hudson, and Central. one of the most ambitious urban development project America has ever seen. Grand Central is New York City's largest building and the largest train station in the country, covering around 22 acres. This massive structure towered over all other buildings in New York at the time. It will take 1,000 workers 2 years to build it. It was a physical representation of the scale and might of Vanderbilt's railroad, and it continues to stamp New York's landscape to this day. Vanderbilt now owns 40% of America's railroads, but he wants them all. Chicago is America's fastest growing city, the line connecting it to New York. The Erie is the most heavily traveled and valuable of all, yet it is not owned by Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt sets his sights on the Erie Railway. While it's currently mismanaged, he recognizes its immense economic potential and envisioning it as a hugely profitable venture. He concocts a plan promising financial gains for all railroads involved. This plan, although risky, is seen as a gamble worth taking. Vanderbilt consults with Frank Work, a trusted advisor and Erie board member, suggesting a railroad cartel to collaboratively set prices, ensuring traffic and profits would be shared among the railways. With Work's agreement, Vanderbilt believes they can convince Daniel Drew to adopt the strategy, aiming for an equal profit share among all three railroads. Just as in his days as a steamboat operator on the Hudson River, Vanderbilt seeks to form an alliance with Drew and secure the Erie Board's approval. However, before the vote on the cartel plan, Drew introduces new board members, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, effectively placeholders to support his agenda. Drew presents Vanderbilt's cartel strategy as a merger of operations, proposing an even split of profits among the railroads. Despite appearances of a democratic process, Drew's intention was clear: to maintain control over Erie's lucrative operations, which, under his guidance, prioritized the benefits of board members over shareholder profits. Realizing Drew's unreliability and the Erie's position as a cash cow exploited for board members' gain rather than stockholder benefit, Vanderbilt decides to use his greatest asset, his vast wealth. He aims to buy as much Erie stock as possible, seeking to gain control over the railway. His goal is to overhaul its management, oust Drew from the board, and run the Erie honestly and equitably, ensuring it serves the broader interests of its investors. Vanderbilt was well aware of Drew's ability to manipulate the Erie stock, a skill that could significantly hinder Vanderbilt's efforts to gain control over the railroad. Understanding the potential for Drew to issue new Erie stock and dilute his ownership stake, Vanderbilt sought to neutralize this threat. He leveraged his connections to file an injunction to prevent Drew's manipulation. Railroads require large amounts of capital to operate and can only be funded by financial markets. So it is not uncommon for a board member like Drew to issue additional stock or bonds to fund new investments. However, Drew has a history of manipulating stock prices for his own financial gain. Vanderbilt attempted to prevent Drew from making any future stock conversions or transactions, but that didn't stop him. Daniel Drew, renowned for his cleverness, found himself at a disadvantage. Unable to read the legal documents handed to him, he relied on his ambitious protégés, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, for interpretation and strategy. Gould, with his high intelligence and cunning, saw a chance to not only help Drew, but eventually seize his position. Gould saw this as his moment to eclipse Drew, contemplating a bold countermove to outmaneuver Vanderbilt at his own game. Together with Fisk, Gould started issuing new shares of their own, engaging in the very practice of stock watering that had been a hallmark of Drew's tenure. This act not only diluted the stock further, but also signified a shift in power dynamics within the Erie Railroad's leadership. Unaware of the stock watering, Vanderbilt continues to buy. The printed shares are hand-delivered to Vanderbilt, who understands he has been tricked. Gould and Fisk obtained $7 million from Vanderbilt by stock manipulation, which is equivalent to $132 million today. Vanderbilt is furious, demanding for the arrest of Gould and Fisk. However, he eventually makes a deal with Drew. In exchange for a complete refund, he will withdraw all allegations against the board members and his ambitions to acquire the Erie. With the Erie War over, Vanderbilt searches for a new edge. He recognizes that the railroads have been overbuilt and that the future is not in producing new supply in the form of additional lines, but in ensuring demand for the supply you deliver, which entails moving new freight, a source of freight that will keep his trains full and offer him a new revenue stream. The Commodore knows exactly where to look. Oil is transforming life in America. Kerosene is produced by refining crude oil, creating a safe and economical source of light. Before kerosene, the average American lacked access to a reliable light source. When the sun set, darkness fell. Kerosene is a phenomenon that will permanently change the way we live. Vanderbilt sees that kerosene use is rising across the country. He understands that to meet demand, kerosene manufacturers will need a way to ship their oil. If Vanderbilt can control the market for those oil shipments, he will return to the top of the railroad industry. Cleveland is the epicenter of the oil boom. While only having a population of 50,000 people, it sits on top of a mountain of oil. Vanderbilt hears about a refinery near Cleveland's railroads, the ideal target for his grand plan. He contacts the owner, a struggling young oil producer named John D. Rockefeller. Vanderbilt sees him as the ideal pawn in his scheme. An exclusive agreement to carry Rockefeller's oil will ensure that the Commodore's trains remain full. So Vanderbilt invites Rockefeller to meet with him in New York. Rockefeller sees it as a method to establish his business. He admired Vanderbilt because he aspired to be the Vanderbilt of petroleum. Cornelius Vanderbilt may be the country's wealthiest and most powerful man, used to getting what he wants. But Rockefeller is a man of destiny. He is searching for an exclusive arrangement that will fill all of the Commodore's trains at a 35% discount. And if the Commodore does not agree to these terms, he will fill someone else's trains. While initially not having half the capacity to fill Vanderbilt's trains, Rockefeller, by real entrepreneurship, outgrows the agreement with the Commodore. Once unable to fill Vanderbilt's trains, he now has more oil than the Commodore can transport, and his main opponent, Tom Scott, knows it. With the railroads desperate for his oil, Rockefeller negotiates a 40% rebate on his contract with Scott, a reduction far greater than what he can receive from Vanderbilt. To Vanderbilt's chagrin, Rockefeller expertly pitted those railroads against one another, and the only way to resist Rockefeller is for the railroads to band together. He establishes an unlikely partnership with his main adversary, Tom Scott. Together, they agree to cancel all of Rockefeller's deals. To Rockefeller, this means war. While looking for a solution, he realizes that he uses pipes to transport his oil inside of his refineries. So why not use those same pipelines to transport that oil outside of his refineries as well? He embarks on an unseen, risky endeavor, the construction of the 4,000 miles of pipelines connecting oil wells to his refineries. As soon as his pipeline is completed, Rockefeller starts pulling his shipments from the railroads. And since the railroads have been drastically overbuilt, losing cargo means losing money. Stocks plummet as investors run scared. By the time the panic is through, 1/3 of the country's 360 railroad companies have gone bankrupt. And for the Commodore, well, in 1873, at the height of the Depression and age 82, Cornelius Vanderbilt dies, leaving all of his wealth to his son, William. Now, while Vanderbilt excelled at spotting opportunities for growth, he lacked at educating his children. They say that the first generation works for it, the second inherits it, and the third squanders it. Well, that is usually due to a lack of education. Inheriting a large sum of money is one thing. Managing it and investing it correctly in the right assets so that it may be passed down to future generations is quite another. Vanderbilt's biggest mistake was only preparing one heir for the fortune, instead of preparing all his children for this. If he had educated all his children equally, he would have greatly boosted the chances of preserving the family fortune that he spent his entire life building.